Hello, dear friends, and welcome to The Sleepy Christian. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Whether you're in a quiet village, a busy city, or somewhere in between, welcome to The Sleepy Christian, where we gently reflect on the quiet moments where God meets us, especially when we feel most alone. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's journey into the story of Hagar, the woman God saw in the wilderness. Hagar's story doesn't begin in a place of glory or comfort. It begins in the background, on the edges of a promise that wasn't meant for her, in a household where she held no power, no voice, and no say in what would happen to her life. She was a servant, an Egyptian woman who belonged to Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Her role was simple, or so it seemed: to serve, to obey, to exist quietly in the shadow of her masters. But God, as we often discover in the quiet corners of Scripture, pays special attention to the ones in the background, to the overlooked, to the weary ones who never asked to be part of the storm. Hagar didn't choose her position. She was likely acquired in Egypt, possibly during Abraham and Sarah's journey there in the time of famine. Her name, Hagar, even sounds foreign to Hebrew ears. It hints at a story of displacement, of someone who doesn't belong. And perhaps that's exactly how she felt. Though she lived in the tents of the great patriarch Abraham, her heart likely knew little peace. She was surrounded by the language of promise, the language of covenant and blessing, but none of it seemed meant for her. Imagine what it must have been like. Day after day, Hagar prepared food, carried water, did the unseen work that kept life running for the household of promise. She heard the name of Yahweh spoken with reverence, watched as Abraham communed with the divine, listened as Sarah was called the mother of nations. But she was just a servant. She was not the chosen one. She was not part of the covenant. She was merely present, watching, silent, waiting. Then, without being asked, her life changed. Sarah, weary of waiting on God's timing, made a desperate decision. She would give her servant to Abraham, hoping that through Hagar, a child could be born. It was a painful solution, born of fear and frustration. And Hagar, like so many women in ancient stories, was not consulted. She was given, passed along like property, her body offered as a vessel for someone else's dream. Perhaps she was afraid. Perhaps she was resigned. Or maybe she dared to hope, just a little, that bearing the child of Abraham might lift her from the shadows, that she might finally be seen. When Hagar became pregnant, something changed. Not just in her body, but in her spirit. She had something now, something Sarah didn't have: a future, a child, a connection to Abraham that went beyond servanthood. And with that came the flicker of pride. Maybe for the first time in her life she felt powerful. Perhaps she held her head a little higher. Maybe she walked differently, spoke with more confidence. After all, she carried within her the son of the patriarch. But that brief light was quickly extinguished. Sarah, now bitter with jealousy and shame, could not stand the presence of the woman she had once pitied and used. The household turned cold. Hagar was treated harshly. Her moment of dignity dissolved into cruel treatment. Her belly grew, but so did the rejection. The walls of the tent that once offered shelter now closed in like a prison. Hagar was not just a servant now, she was a threat. She was a reminder of Sarah's emptiness, a reminder of human impatience with divine timing. And so, the woman who had once been invisible became the target of bitterness. Perhaps her name was spoken with disdain. Perhaps she was excluded from daily rituals, made to feel even more like a stranger in the place she had called home. In that house, so full of promise, so central to God's great plan, Hagar felt like a mistake, like collateral damage in someone else's story. But God does not forget those who suffer in silence. Even when the world turns its face away, Even when those in power use and discard the vulnerable, God sees. And as Hagar's pain deepened, as the warmth of her small hope faded into despair, something began to stir, not in the tents of Abraham, but in the heart of heaven itself. Because the God of the covenant is also the God of the overlooked. The story of Hagar is not an accident. It is a quiet revelation, reminding us that even when we are not the heroes of the tale, we are never outside the sight of God. Even servants, even the forgotten, even the ones who never asked to be chosen, but were by grace seen anyway. Hagar's pregnancy should have been a moment of celebration, of recognition, even of quiet triumph. In the eyes of the culture she lived in, bearing a child, especially a son, was a source of honor. And to bear the child of a great man like Abraham should have elevated her. It should have brought her comfort, maybe even a sense of security. But instead, it opened the door to pain she could never have foreseen. The truth was, Hagar was never loved. She was never chosen in the way a woman desires to be chosen. She was never wooed, never asked. She was used. Not cruelly, perhaps not even with deliberate malice, but still used. Her body became a tool in a desperate plan, her womb a substitute altar for someone else's sacrifice. Sarah, once her mistress, handed her over in an act of calculated despair. Abraham, the man of faith, agreed in silence. No one asked, "Hagar, are you ready?" No one asked, "Hagar, do you want this?" No one saw her as more than a means to an end. At first, there may have been a flicker of hope, a swelling pride, a voice inside her whispering, "Perhaps now they'll see me. Perhaps now I matter." She was carrying the child that could end years of waiting. She was no longer just the servant from Egypt. She was the mother of Abraham's heir. But pride is a fragile thing when built on unstable ground. And whatever power Hagar thought she had gained quickly turned to ash in her hands. Sarah's reaction was swift and bitter. The very thing she had orchestrated now mocked her. Every glance at Hagar's growing belly reminded her of what she lacked. Every movement, every breath of this younger woman became unbearable. Perhaps she saw Hagar walking with her hand protectively resting on her womb, a quiet smile on her lips. Perhaps she saw the subtle shift in her eyes, no longer downcast, but steady. And that was enough to ignite fury. Hagar had become too much, too visible, too real. So Sarah turned cold. The Bible tells us she dealt harshly with Hagar. But what does that mean in human terms? Maybe it meant constant criticism, sharp, whispered insults as she passed. Maybe it meant impossible chores, endless labor, nights spent on the cold ground while others rested comfortably. Maybe it meant being ignored entirely, treated as if she were no longer a person, just a vessel, a mistake waiting to be undone. Day by day, the rejection deepened. What began as tension turned into cruelty, and Hagar, once filled with the light of new life, was now filled with the weight of sorrow. To be used is a profound kind of wounding. It leaves a scar not just on the body, but on the soul. Hagar had no choice. She gave herself because she had no power to say no. And yet now, the very act she had no control over became the source of her shame. The very life growing inside her, once a sign of connection, now made her a threat, a rival. Her child was no longer a promise. He was a problem. Imagine the loneliness. To be surrounded by people but utterly alone. To feel life kicking inside your belly while your own heart breaks. To serve the ones who scorn you. To try to stay invisible, even as your body betrays you, growing larger, more undeniable every day. There is a sorrow that comes from being discarded, but there is a deeper sorrow that comes from being needed and discarded at the same time. Hagar was no longer just a servant. She was a reminder of failure, a symbol of misplaced faith, and no one wanted her anymore. There's a quiet violence in being tolerated but not welcomed, in being essential but not embraced. And this is the pain Hagar carried. It wasn't just physical discomfort or emotional rejection, it was spiritual confusion. How could this be happening in the house of God's promise? How could this much hurt exist in a place blessed by the Lord? Was she cursed, forgotten, or was she simply collateral damage in a divine plan too large to care for one small woman? And perhaps that's the question many hearts still carry today. What do I do when I've been used? What do I do when the people of God or the circumstances of life reduce me to a function instead of seeing me as a soul? Hagar's story gives no easy answers, but it does offer something deeper, a recognition, a validation, that the pain of being used is real, that the suffering of the unnoticed is not unnoticed by God. Because even in her despair, even in the cruelty she endured, even as her tears fell silently in the dark, Hagar was seen. Every act of injustice was recorded in heaven's memory. Every moment she was dehumanized was noticed by the divine. The God of the universe does not overlook those who are broken in the service of others. He sees, he listens, and soon he will speak. But for now, in this part of the story, Hagar is still in the middle of the pain, still caught between two forces too powerful to resist, still wondering what her place is and why it hurts so much to simply be who she was forced to become. She was not rebellious, she was not foolish, she was simply used. And that pain matters. It mattered then, it matters now, and it matters to God. The desert is not always a place we choose. Sometimes it is a place we flee to, not because we're strong, but because we've run out of options. That's where Hagar found herself, in the wilderness, alone, pregnant, frightened. She didn't leave Abraham's camp with a plan. She didn't leave with a caravan, supplies, or protection. She simply ran, away from the pain, away from the insults, away from the unbearable tension that filled every breath in that household. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. The wilderness is not just a place on a map, it's a spiritual condition. It's where we end up when we've been pushed too far. When our hearts are raw, our spirits are weary, and we can no longer stay where we were. For Hagar, the desert was not a destination, it was an escape. She fled from the cruelty of Sarah, from the silence of Abraham, and from the role she never asked to play. Her footsteps marked a path not towards something, but away from everything. The Bible tells us she fled toward Shur, a vast and desolate place between Egypt and Canaan. It's telling that she went in that direction, back toward Egypt, back toward the land she came from. Perhaps she hoped to return to what she once knew, even if it wasn't much. Maybe Egypt represented a memory of freedom, or at least familiarity. It's a natural human instinct. When everything falls apart, we try to go back. Back to before the pain. Back to before we were broken. But this journey wasn't easy. The desert is unforgiving. The sun scorches. The nights freeze. The sand gets into everything. Your clothes, your eyes, your soul. And Hagar, pregnant and alone, would have felt every mile of that pain. She was likely barefoot, perhaps carrying nothing but a small skin of water. Her body, already strained by pregnancy, weakened with each step. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. Thirst dried her mouth. Fear clung to her skin. Every shadow could be danger. Every noise a threat. Wild animals, bandits, exposure, miscarriage, death. Yet she kept walking. There's a quiet strength in that, a strength the world often overlooks. Hagar didn't have a sword or a strategy. She had no map, no help, no promise to cling to. But she had her will, and that will drove her into the unknown, because staying in a place where she was mistreated had become more unbearable than risking her life on open ground. How many of us have walked into our own wildernesses with nothing but pain as our guide, not knowing what we were walking toward, only knowing what we had to get away from? Abuse, neglect, betrayal, silence. Sometimes it takes everything in us just to leave, just to say, I can't do this anymore. That's what Hagar did. And in doing so, she joined a sacred lineage, those who wandered, not in strength, but in desperation. But the wilderness is not just a place of escape, it is also a place of encounter. As Hagar stumbled through the desert, she came to a spring, a small patch of mercy in a vast field of suffering. We don't know how long she had wandered before she found it. Hours, days, maybe longer. But we can imagine her collapse, the way her knees buckled as she saw water shimmering in the distance, the way her hands trembled as she cupped the precious liquid, the tears that fell, not just of relief, but of exhaustion, the kind of crying that only happens when you've been strong for too long, and there's finally no one watching. And there, in that moment of weakness, in that unguarded, dusty silence, God came to her. But before that divine meeting, there was the stillness, the unbearable stillness of the wilderness, when there's no noise to drown out your thoughts, no distractions to keep the grief at bay. That's when your memories speak loudest. That's when the pain you tried to outrun catches up. Hagar might have sat there, staring at her reflection in the water, wondering how her life had come to this. She had done nothing wrong. She had obeyed. She had submitted. She had served. And still, she was cast out like nothing. It's in that silence that the soul questions, who am I? Do I matter? Am I just a tool? Will anyone come looking for me? In her culture, Hagar was disposable, a servant, a foreigner, a woman, a single mother. Alone in the wilderness, she had no legal protection, no status, no tribe to defend her, and yet she was not forgotten. This is the sacred truth buried in her story. The wilderness is not empty. It may feel like exile, but God is there, watching, waiting, preparing to speak. The silence is not abandonment. It is a pause before divine revelation. Before she heard his voice, Hagar had to be emptied of her pride, of her illusions, of the false hope that people would rescue her. In the desert, all she had was herself. And sometimes, that is where God meets us. Not in the crowd, not in the comfort, but in the collapse. She didn't know it yet, but her steps through the sand were not wasted. Her pain was not pointless. Her running was not rebellion. It was the beginning of a sacred journey. She was about to become the first person in the Bible to give God a name. But before she could name him, she had to meet him. And before she could meet him, she had to be brought low enough to listen. That is the paradox of the wilderness. It breaks us open, only so that God can pour something new inside. And so Hagar sat by the spring, the desert wind brushing against her face, the weight of her unborn child pressing into her bones, her past behind her, and no clear future in sight. But heaven was watching, and her story was not over. The moment came not with thunder, not with lightning, not with a trumpet from the skies, but in the quiet stillness of the desert, beside a spring of water. Hagar was exhausted, alone, afraid. Her feet were sore, her body was aching, her heart was overwhelmed. She had not expected to find anyone in this barren place, let alone God. But that's the mystery of the divine. He often shows up where we least expect him, especially when we are at our lowest. Hagar had not gone looking for God. She had gone looking for escape, for survival, for something, anything that would free her from the weight of her pain. But God was looking for her. He didn't wait for her to come back. He didn't leave her to sort it out on her own. He found her. And in doing so, he revealed one of the most beautiful and comforting truths in all of Scripture. God is a God who seeks the outcast. The Bible says, "The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert." That phrase, "found Hagar," is deeply personal. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't coincidence. God was looking for her. He knew where she was. He knew what she was running from. He knew what she carried in her womb and in her heart. And he came to meet her, not with judgment, not with anger, but with presence. We must pause here because this moment is sacred. Hagar is the first person in the Bible to be visited by the angel of the Lord. Not Abraham, not Sarah, not even Noah or Isaac or Jacob. Hagar, a servant, a foreigner, a pregnant runaway woman with no status, no power, and no protection. And yet, heaven bowed low to meet her in the dust. What does this tell us about God? It tells us that his heart is drawn to the suffering, that he does not measure our worth by the standards of the world, that he comes near not only to the righteous and powerful, but to the wounded and lost. Hagar didn't have to prove herself. She didn't have to earn the encounter. She simply had to be broken enough to receive it. And when the angel of the Lord speaks, he doesn't begin with commands or corrections. He begins with a question. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" It is a question that echoes through time, asked not just to Hagar, but to every soul that has ever wandered into the wilderness. It is a question of identity and direction. It's a way of saying, "Tell me your story, let me hear your pain, let me walk with you in your confusion." Notice how God addresses her, Hagar, servant of Sarai. He calls her by name. In a world where she was property, where people used her without acknowledging her humanity, God calls her by name. He sees her, he knows her, and he affirms her story, even the part she may have wanted to forget. God doesn't erase her reality. He enters into it. Where have you come from? It is a question full of tenderness. He is not demanding an answer for his own information. He knows. He's inviting her to speak, to tell her truth, to unburden herself. Sometimes we carry our pain so tightly that we forget what it feels like to let it out. But here, beside the spring, God gently opens a space for Hagar to remember, to reflect, and to be honest. And where are you going? It's a harder question, because the truth is, she didn't know. She had fled out of pain, not purpose. She was walking blindly, guided only by the need to escape. And yet God's question points to something deeper. It invites her to dream again, to think of a future, to imagine that there is a path ahead, even when it feels like there is none. There is such intimacy in this encounter. The angel of the Lord does not hover above her, distant and divine. He comes close. He speaks. He listens. He meets her in her reality, not in the house of Abraham, but in the raw, unfiltered honesty of the wilderness. And in doing so, he reveals a side of God that is easy to forget when life is going well. God is the one who finds us in our flight, not just our faith. Think of what this must have meant to Hagar. To be found, to be acknowledged, to be spoken to as a person, not a problem. The very God of the covenant, the same God who made promises to Abraham, now speaks directly to her. She is not invisible. She is not forgotten. She is not forsaken. So many people carry wilderness within them, emotional deserts, spiritual fatigue, seasons of life where they feel cast aside, mistreated, or abandoned. And Hagar's story becomes their story, not because they are the same, but because the God who met her is the same. He still comes to us in our desolate places. He still finds us by the spring, when we are too tired to keep going. He still speaks into our silence. This is not just a story about a woman long ago. It is a living parable for today. God finds the wounded. He finds the ones who are trying to escape but don't know where they're headed. He finds the ones who have been used and discarded. He finds the ones who feel they are too far gone, too broken, too small to matter. And when he finds us, he doesn't just give instructions. He gives comfort. He gives attention. He gives dignity. The wilderness may be harsh. The desert may be vast. But God is not far. In the middle of nowhere, under a relentless sun, with a weary heart and a child in her womb, Hagar encountered the living God. And that changed everything. Hagar sat beside the spring, exhausted from the journey and uncertain of what lay ahead. Her heart was heavy, her spirit crushed. And then came the voice that pierced through the silence. Not a shout, not a command, but a question, a gentle question. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from? It's easy to skip over questions like this, to treat them as narrative filler. But in Scripture, God's questions are never meaningless. They are invitations, they are revelations. And this one is no different. God wasn't asking for directions. He already knew where Hagar came from. He wasn't seeking information. He was offering restoration. This was not the voice of a demanding master. It was the voice of a loving father calling his lost daughter to speak. Where have you come from? The words hung in the air, waiting for her to respond. Not just with a place, but with her story. The question pulled her backward, not to shame her, but to help her face the pain she had been running from. Because we cannot heal from what we refuse to name. We cannot move forward until we face where we've been. And for Hagar, the answer was layered with sorrow. Where had she come from? From a home where she was a stranger, from a family that had used her body but never honored her soul, from a place where promises were made to others, while she was asked to remain silent and compliant. She came from bitter glances, from harsh treatment, from nights spent wondering if she would ever be more than a shadow in someone else's story. She came from Sarah's tent, where once she had served faithfully, only to be turned into a tool. She came from Abraham's embrace, not out of love, but out of convenience. She came from the sting of betrayal, from the confusion of being both elevated and discarded. And she came from her own rising pride. Yes, that too. From the fleeting sense of importance that her pregnancy had given her. And the bitter fall that followed when she realized it hadn't changed how anyone truly saw her. She had come from pain, deep, layered, soul-wrenching pain. And God was asking her to look at it, not to punish her, but to remind her, I see all of it. I see you. There is something profoundly healing in being asked to tell your story, not the version you tell others to keep up appearances, but the raw truth. Where have you come from? What have you survived? What have you lost? What did it cost you just to keep going? God wanted Hagar to bring it all out of the shadows and into the light, not for his sake, but for hers. The wilderness had stripped away everything that protected her, everything that numbed her. And in that vulnerable space, God offered her a choice: to stay hidden in pain, or to bring it forward into conversation with him. The same God who would one day ask Job out of the whirlwind, who would challenge Jonah under the withered plant, who would whisper to Elijah in the cave, now asked Hagar to reflect, not just on her circumstances, but on her journey. But that wasn't the only question. After, where have you come from, came a second question, just as piercing, just as gentle. And where are you going? At first it seems simple, but the truth is, Hagar had no idea. She wasn't running towards something. She was running away. She had no destination, only distance. She didn't have a plan, only a need to escape the pain behind her. And so, when God asked her, "Where are you going?" she was faced with the emptiness of her path. The future was a blank page. She had no tribe to return to, no husband, no safety, no promise of welcome in Egypt, her homeland. And yet, in asking the question, God wasn't demanding that she already know the answer. He was awakening something within her, a realization that even in her aimlessness, even in her confusion, he was there, that her journey mattered, that the direction of her life was not meaningless, that there was still a future worth living for. God didn't scold her for fleeing. He didn't belittle her for not having a plan. He simply met her in the middle of her uncertainty and gave her space to admit, "I don't know." How often are we, like Hagar, caught between where we've been and where we're going, unsure of how to move forward, scared to look back? The past is too painful to revisit. The future is too foggy to face. And yet God calls us, gently, to name them both. To tell him the whole story, not because he needs to hear it, but because we need to speak it. This is the beginning of transformation, not a miracle in the sky, not a sudden change in circumstance, but a conversation, a question, a safe space where a broken, hurting woman could be honest before her Creator. And in this moment, we glimpse a powerful truth about God's character. He is not only the God of answers, he is the God of questions, the God who listens, the God who meets us not when we figured everything out, but when we admit we don't even know where we're headed. For Hagar, these questions marked the turning point. She was still in the desert, still pregnant, still technically a servant. But now she was seen. Now she was heard. Now she had been drawn into a dialogue with the divine. Her past was not erased. Her wounds were not ignored, but they were brought into sacred conversation. And that changed everything. God could have rescued her without speaking. He could have sent her back with a command alone. But instead, he sat beside her pain and invited her to share. That is the kind of God he is. A God who meets us in the wilderness and instead of pushing us forward or dragging us back, simply asks, "Where have you come from? And where are you going?" And then, in the silence that follows, he listens. The desert around Hagar was vast and silent, but in the stillness following God's questions, something began to shift. She was no longer simply a fleeing servant. She was now someone God had spoken to. She was someone God had asked to reflect, to remember, and to dream. But the story didn't end there. God didn't merely ask Hagar to recall her past and confront her aimlessness. He gave her something most precious: purpose. Direction A, divine message that would lift her from despair and plant her feet on the soil of meaning once more. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." It is a difficult thing to hear, jarring even. Return to the place of your pain. Go back to the woman who mistreated you. Walk into the very house that made you feel like nothing. To our modern ears, this command feels harsh, and yet, it was not a sentence. It was a redirection, because God did not tell Hagar to return empty-handed. He told her to return with a promise. Before Hagar could grasp the fullness of that promise, she had to be reminded that her life was not spiraling out of control. It was unfolding under divine guidance. And that even the painful chapters were not wasted. The desert was not her destination. It was the place where she would receive a message that would define her story forever. God wasn't sending her back as the same woman who fled. He was sending her back as a woman who had been seen, heard, and chosen for something bigger. And so he spoke. "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." This was not a casual blessing. This was a covenantal word. The very language that God had used with Abraham was now being spoken to Hagar. A woman with no claim to inheritance, no status in the eyes of society, no legal rights, was now receiving a divine promise of legacy. Her child would not be a mistake. Her suffering would not end in silence. Her story would ripple through generations. Her descendants would be many, too many to count. In that moment, God took a woman who had been used for someone else's legacy and gave her a legacy of her own. Can you feel the weight of that transformation? 1 minute she was a discarded servant running with no destination. The next, she was a matriarch, promised by God Himself that her lineage would endure. Not merely endure, but multiply. God wasn't offering her comfort alone. He was offering her identity. He was giving her back her voice, her worth, her future. And then He gave her the name of her son. You shall name him Ishmael. The name was not random. It meant something sacred. God hears. Every time she would speak her son's name, she would be reminded, God heard me in my affliction. The very name of her child would be a testimony, a living memorial to her encounter with the divine in the wilderness. She was no longer nameless pain. She was a mother with a mission. She had met the God who listens, and her son would bear that truth for all to see. But God went further. He described the child growing in her womb, not just as a blessing, but as a force. A wild donkey of a man, God said. Free, untamed, strong. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he would live in hostility toward all his brothers. At first, that sounds harsh, even ominous. But to a servant woman whose life had been confined by power and domination, this was a promise of freedom. Ishmael would not be enslaved. He would not be small. He would not live under the crushing weight of someone else's authority. He would be wild, fiercely independent, untamable, living beyond the boundaries others tried to impose. This was not a curse. It was liberation. It was God saying, your son will not inherit your chains. He will not walk in your shadow. He will be his own. What a profound gift that must have been to Hagar. Not just that she had a future, but that her child would have one too. And not just any future, a future full of strength, legacy, and divine recognition. The one whom others had ignored was now named and known. The womb that had once been used now carried a world-changing child. The servant woman was now the bearer of a promise. But this promise didn't erase the difficulty of her return. The road back to Abraham's tents would not be easy. The household dynamics would remain tense. Sarah's resentment wouldn't vanish overnight. But now, Hagar would walk differently. Not because her situation had changed, but because she had. She was no longer returning as a nameless girl fleeing abuse. She was returning as a woman who had spoken with God, a woman entrusted with prophecy, a woman carrying a child whose name testified to her suffering and her strength. This is the heart of God's redirection. He doesn't always take us away from our suffering. Sometimes He asks us to walk back into it, but not as victims, as vessels, as transformed, awakened souls who carry promises far greater than the pain behind them. And that's what Hagar was becoming. Her time in the desert wasn't punishment, it was preparation. God wasn't just sending her back, He was sending her forward, through the place of her past, into the future He had just spoken into existence. Return and submit, not in weakness, but in wisdom. Return, not to be crushed, but to carry the fire of divine encounter into a place that had once broken you. For Hagar, this moment in the wilderness was not an interruption in her story. It was the turning point, the place where her identity was reclaimed, her dignity restored, and her future revealed. And for us, it is a reminder that God doesn't just rescue us from pain. Sometimes He walks with us through it. changing who we are in the process. When we don't know where we're going, when all we can do is run, when we think no one sees us, He comes. And when He does, He calls us not only to remember where we've been, but to trust that He is shaping where we're going, even if that means returning, even if that means walking straight back into the shadows with the light of heaven now burning in our hearts. The words God spoke to Hagar in the wilderness were not just kind, they were transformative. They didn't simply comfort her, they restored her identity and gave her a future. For a woman who had been silenced, dismissed, and mistreated, this was everything. But God did not stop at comforting words. He gave Hagar a promise, and not a small one, a divine, generational promise, rooted in the very fabric of God's redemptive work in the world. I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. This language was familiar. It echoed the words spoken to Abraham, the man of covenant, the father of nations. But now, incredibly, those same words were being spoken to Hagar, the servant, the outsider, the one who had been cast out. She wasn't a Hebrew. She wasn't married. She had no power, no land, no claim. And yet, God made her a matriarch, a founder of a nation. Can we even begin to understand what that meant to her? Hagar lived in a world where women's worth was tied to men, fathers, husbands, sons. A woman without status or protection was as good as invisible. But God didn't see her that way. While others saw her as disposable, God saw her as essential. He gave her the dignity of destiny. He didn't just see her suffering, He honored it, and then He built something eternal upon it. God told her that the child she carried would be named Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction. Not only was her pain acknowledged, it was remembered, immortalized, preserved in the very name of her son. Every time she would call out Ishmael, she would remember, God hears. Every time he laughed or cried or grew stronger, she would know, God saw me when no one else did. And then, God described this child, not in the soft terms we might expect, but in a way that reveals something fierce and untamed. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. To many, this might sound like a curse, like a prophecy of conflict. But to Hagar, this would have sounded like liberation. This child would not be tamed. He would not be enslaved. He would not be subjugated. He would live freely, independently, wildly. This was the language of freedom in a world of oppression. Hagar had known what it was like to be controlled, to be passed from one authority to another. Her decisions made for her body used, her voice suppressed. But her son, would be no one's servant. He would roam the earth on his own terms, head held high, unconquered. Imagine how those words rang in her ears. In the vastness of the desert, where she had expected to die, she received a vision of life, not just for herself, but for generations yet to come. And yet, the promise was not just about quantity or freedom. It was about value. Hagar mattered to God. Her story mattered. Her suffering was not a side note in someone else's legacy. It was the soil in which a new promise was planted. This is one of the most radical moments in Scripture, because for the first time, we see the God of Abraham reaching beyond the chosen lineage, beyond the official channels, and offering his presence, his voice, and his future to someone entirely outside the covenant circle. Hagar's encounter reminds us that God is not limited by human hierarchy. He sees what others ignore. He blesses whom others exclude. She had no temple, no altar, no priest. She didn't offer a sacrifice. She didn't go on a pilgrimage. She was simply a woman in pain. And that was enough for God. And it is enough still. There are many people who feel like Hagar, those whose stories are written on the margins, those who have been used and discarded, those who feel like their lives are going nowhere, that their pain is pointless, that no one hears the cries in the night. And to them, Hagar's story offers a sacred truth. God sees you, God hears you, and God can build a future from your brokenness. He is not limited to sanctuaries and ceremonies. He meets us at springs in the desert, in the quiet spaces of collapse, in the places no one else would think to look. And when he speaks, it is not always in soft words. Sometimes it is wild and defiant. Sometimes the promise sounds strange to our ears, like a child who will live in tension with the world. But that too is divine. Because God doesn't always promise ease. He promises purpose. And Hagar had received hers. The child in her womb was not an accident. Her suffering had not gone unnoticed, and her future was not over. God had met her in the wilderness, not to scold her, not to shame her, but to bless her. So often, we think of blessings as comfort and peace, but for Hagar, blessing meant being seen. It meant being heard. It meant that her son would be free, that her pain would be remembered, and that her story would never again be invisible. She would never be the same again. The promise God gave her in the wilderness didn't remove her struggles, but it reframed them. Her hardship was no longer just suffering. It was part of a divine narrative. Her journey was no longer senseless wandering. It had become the birthplace of a legacy. And that is what the promises of God often do. They don't always rescue us from the desert, but they give us the strength to walk through it with new eyes, with new hope, with new identity. Hagar had come into the wilderness fleeing rejection, humiliation, and fear. She would leave it with a promise that the world could never take from her. She was not just a servant, not just a mother, not just a refugee. She was a woman chosen by God to carry a name, a nation, and a truth. God hears the afflicted. And so her story, the story of a slave woman with no voice, became a sacred testimony, a declaration that no one is too small for God's attention, and no pain is too hidden for His compassion. It was after the encounter, after the questions, after the promise, after the revelation about her child, that something truly extraordinary happened. Something that had never occurred before in all the stories of Scripture up to that point. Hagar, the servant girl, the outcast, the foreigner, the pregnant runaway, did something no one else had ever done. She gave God a name. She said, "You are El Roi," meaning the God who sees me. Let that settle in. Not Abraham, not Noah, not Jacob, not even Moses. It was Hagar, alone, in the desert, with dirt on her feet and tears on her face, who dared to name God. And the name she chose wasn't one of power, might, or majesty. It wasn't Lord of Hosts or King of Heaven or Creator of the universe. It was personal, intimate. The God who sees me. Not the God who sees all, though that is true. Not the God who watches over nations, though He does. But me, Hagar, the one everyone overlooked, the one everyone used, the one who didn't belong. She looked up into the sky, placed her hand on her swelling belly, and whispered, "He sees me." That one sentence is a whole theology. Because there are moments in life when that is the only truth we can cling to. Not that everything will be fixed. Not that justice will arrive right away. Not that the road ahead will be easy, but simply this: God sees me. And not just sees in the way people glance at each other on a crowded street, not the way someone watches from a distance. This kind of seeing is different. This is the seeing of full attention, the seeing that understands, the seeing that says, "I know your whole story. I know the pain behind your silence. I know the weight you carry in your chest at night when you can't sleep. I know what they did to you. I know how you feel invisible. I know how you wonder if your life matters. I see it all, and still, I am with you. This is the power of the name El Roi. It is not a theological argument. It is not a doctrine. It is a lived reality. It's a name that is born in suffering, in wilderness, in uncertainty. It's not the kind of name you learn in books. It's the kind of name you cry out when your world is broken down and God meets you in the middle of it. That's when you discover, He sees me. There are countless people who live in quiet anguish, who serve faithfully, love deeply, and carry burdens no one else notices. People who cry in locked bathrooms. People who sit in waiting rooms with hands trembling. People who go home to silence and wonder if anyone would notice if they disappeared. And into that kind of world, into those kinds of lives, the story of Hagar speaks with breathtaking tenderness. You are seen. You don't have to be powerful to be seen. You don't have to be important by the world's standards. You don't need a title, a platform, or applause. God saw Hagar not after she returned to Abraham, not after she gave birth, not after she fulfilled some role. He saw her in the wilderness, in the middle of her running, while she was scared, bitter, confused, and utterly alone. That is the kind of God El Roi is. And Hagar was so moved by this encounter that she not only named God, she named the place. The text says, that is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It means, the well of the living one who sees me. She turned her encounter into a testimony. She built a marker so that anyone who came that way would know, this is where heaven touched earth. This is where the unseen one was seen. In the ancient world, wells were sacred places. They were sources of life, places where people gathered, rested, and remembered. And now, because of Hagar, this particular well would carry a holy legacy. Every time someone drew water there, they would whisper the name, the well of the living one who sees me. It would become a sacred echo carried on desert winds. Imagine Hagar, still dusty, still tired, but standing taller than she had in days, lifting her eyes and realizing, I am not alone. I am not forgotten. God knows my name, and I have given him one in return. And this is why her story matters. This is why her name still matters. Because in a world that tells us to hide our pain, to keep moving, to stay small, Hagar's story invites us to pause, to speak, to weep, to name the God who sees us. There's a reason this story is preserved in Scripture, not as a side note, not as a moral cautionary tale, but as a revelation, because God wanted us to know, long before laws were given, long before kings ruled, long before the temple was built. He was already meeting people in the wilderness. He was already stooping down to hear the cries of servants. He was already being named by the wounded. This is the same God who later saw Leah unloved by her husband, the same God who saw Hannah weeping in the temple, the same God who saw the widow dropping 2 coins into the temple treasury, the same God who saw the woman bleeding for 12 years, the same God who saw the thief on the cross. He is El Roi, the God who sees what others miss. And if he saw Hagar, he sees you. He sees the layers of pain you don't know how to explain. He sees the effort it takes to get out of bed some days. He sees the kindness you give to others while waiting for someone to give it to you. He sees the private tears, the silent prayers, the questions that remain unanswered. You don't have to strive to be seen by God. You don't have to achieve, impress, or even understand him fully. Hagar didn't know everything. She didn't have all the answers. What she had was a moment of divine recognition. And it was enough. Enough to change how she saw herself, enough to give her strength to return, enough to carry her through what lay ahead. She didn't just survive the wilderness. She named it. She transformed it. She made it sacred. Because once you've been seen by God, even the desert becomes holy ground. After the encounter beside the spring, after the voice of God had pierced through her despair and lifted her spirit, Hagar did something we often overlook. She rested. She did not immediately rush back to Abraham's household. She didn't leap to her feet in triumph or sprint to fulfill her new instructions. She lingered. She remained. She stayed beside the well, where she had met the living God. And in doing so, she gave us one of the most important and often forgotten spiritual disciplines: resting in the wilderness. For many of us, especially in times of chaos, our first instinct is to act. We want to solve things, fix what's broken, escape what hurts. Even when we encounter God, we feel pressure to do something with that experience, go back, move forward, change our circumstances. But not Hagar. She allowed herself to breathe. She let the silence settle around her without fear. She sat with the moment and let it reshape her soul. This well, now called Bir Lahai Roi, had become sacred ground, not because the landscape changed, but because she had changed. It was the same desert, the same dust, the same barren expanse, but now it was touched by divine presence. And Hagar, for the first time in a long time, was not just surviving. She was resting. The wilderness is not usually a place of comfort. It is dry, harsh, merciless. It strips away the unnecessary. It exposes the soul. And yet, because of God's presence, that desert had become a sanctuary, a place of stillness, of revelation, of peace. And in that space, Hagar found something she had not known in a long time: dignity. Resting does not mean passivity. It means letting the truth of God's presence sink deep into the heart. Hagar had heard promises, received a blessing, seen the face of the God who sees. But it was in the rest that those truths were sealed in her spirit. She needed time to absorb the gravity of what had happened. She needed to feel her breath slow, her shoulders relax, her soul uncoil from fear. This was the beginning of healing. We live in a world that doesn't value this kind of pause. It tells us to move on quickly, to bounce back, to turn spiritual moments into productivity. But the wilderness teaches us something different. It teaches us to stop, to sit in the presence of God, not for answers or action, but for communion. And it is in that kind of rest that our identity is reshaped. For Hagar, resting in the wilderness was also a way of reclaiming herself. She had been defined by others for so long: servant of Sarai, mistress, foreigner, mother of a problem. She had worn those labels like heavy garments, but here, by this spring, she laid them down. She was not running anymore. She was not hiding. She was simply seen, and in the stillness, she allowed that new truth to sink in. There is something incredibly healing about being seen and then not having to do anything with it immediately, just letting it be, just letting the gaze of God rest upon you, like sunlight warming a bruised body. Hagar was under no pressure to prove herself, explain herself, or justify her pain. She was held in that sacred space, just as she was. We don't often realize how much our souls long for that kind of pause, that divine permission to be. And in that rest, something else happened, something subtle but powerful. Hagar began to believe again, not just in God, but in herself, in her child, in the future, in the idea that she could return and not be crushed by what had once destroyed her. The promise gave her hope, but the rest gave her strength. Because when God tells us to return to something hard, He also gives us what we need to survive it. He never sends us empty, but often what we need is not a battle plan. It's a moment of quiet, a moment to let the wounds breathe, a moment to remember who we are. In that pause, Hagar's posture shifted. She was no longer the runaway. She was the one who had met God, the one who had named him, the one who would give birth to Ishmael, not as a mark of shame, but as a child of divine promise. This rest was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, sacred. She was not lying down to give up. She was sitting in the stillness to gather herself, to gather her courage, to gather her soul. In many ways, this moment mirrors the Sabbath, the holy rest God commanded his people to keep. And yet, it happened before the law, before the commandments. Hagar's rest wasn't ritual, it was instinct, a spiritual exhale, a breath of grace in the dust of suffering. She did not need permission to stop. God's presence was enough to make her pause. Because when you know you are seen, you no longer have to rush to prove anything. The wilderness can break us, but it can also remake us. And what determines the difference is often whether or not we allow ourselves to rest in it. Not every desert moment is a punishment. Some are invitations. Not every wilderness is a place of exile. Some are altars. And not every silence is absence. Sometimes it is the hush before transformation. Hagar stayed by that well long enough to be changed. And when she rose, she did so not with trembling hands, but with steady feet. She still had to return. She still had to face Sarai. But now, she carried something no one could take from her. She knew the God who sees. She had rested in his presence. She had sat in his peace. And that rest gave her the strength to face the road ahead. This is the gift of holy rest. Not escape from life, but courage to live it fully. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of God in the midst of it. Hagar's pause by the spring was not a delay. It was a divine preparation. And maybe, just maybe, that is what you need too. Not to run, not to fix everything, not even to understand it all. Just to stop, just to rest, just to let the God who sees hold you for a moment longer before you go. Because sometimes the most sacred thing we can do in the wilderness is to stay still long enough to know we're not alone. There are seasons in life when we feel invisible, when the world moves around us with indifference, when people speak about us but not to us, when we carry burdens no one acknowledges, and our stories seem small, fragile, or irrelevant. In those moments, we begin to wonder whether we truly matter, whether our presence makes any difference, whether our pain is noticed, our tears remembered, our prayers heard. Hagar's story reaches its quiet climax in this very space, the space of being invisible, unwanted, unimportant in the eyes of those around her. She had been used, mistreated, cast aside. She had no power, no rights, no voice. Even the life growing within her had become a source of conflict rather than celebration. She was a woman alone in every possible way, socially, emotionally, spiritually. And yet, in that wilderness, in that fragile state, she was chosen by God to carry one of the most profound truths ever spoken. You are seen. This truth did not erase her hardships. It did not promise her an easy life. It did not remove the challenges waiting for her back in the household of Abraham and Sarah. But it gave her something even deeper. Dignity. Not a dignity bestowed by humans which can be taken away, but a dignity that comes from being seen and known by the Creator himself. When you feel invisible, it is not simply that others don't notice you. It's that your very existence begins to feel blurry. Your identity erodes under the weight of indifference. You begin to question your worth. You start to believe the lie that perhaps you are forgettable, replaceable, that maybe the world would go on just the same without you. But Hagar's story stands like a beacon against that lie. Because if God saw her, a servant, a foreigner, a pregnant runaway with no protection and no standing, then he sees you. He sees the mother doing everything alone. He sees the person quietly grieving while pretending to be strong. He sees the one working endless hours in a job where no one says thank you. He sees the child who cries behind closed doors, the elder whose phone no longer rings, the dreamer who has stopped dreaming because disappointment has visited too often. He sees all of it, and not only does he see, he comes close. He didn't just observe Hagar from a distance. He met her at the spring. He engaged her in conversation. He asked her questions. He listened. He gave her direction and a promise. And most of all, he gave her a name for himself, El Roi, the God who sees me. This was not an abstract theological idea. This was her lived experience. She didn't learn it from a scroll. She learned it from survival, from suffering, from the wilderness. And perhaps that's where we learn it too, not in the comfortable places, but in the wilderness moments of life, when we are stripped of pretense, when no one else is watching, when we are tempted to believe that we don't matter, that our life has no meaning, that we've been forgotten. But we are not forgotten. Hagar's return to Abraham's household was not a retreat into silence. It was a return with identity. She was no longer the invisible one. She was no longer merely the Egyptian servant. She had encountered God. She carried a promise. She had named the spring. She had named God. And she would name her son Ishmael, a name that would always remind her that even in her darkest hour, God had listened. That name became her anchor. Every time she whispered it, shouted it, called her child in from the distance, she was proclaiming a truth to herself and the world. God hears, God sees, God remembers. This is not just Hagar's story, it is the story of every person who has ever felt erased, overlooked, diminished. It's the story of how divine attention dignifies human suffering, how the smallest, most fragile moments of our lives are not small to God. When you feel invisible, remember this. Hagar didn't have to climb a mountain to reach God. She didn't have to perform a ritual, recite a perfect prayer, or prove her worth. She simply was, broken, tired, and alone. And that was enough for God to come find her. Your pain is not too small for him. Your questions are not too messy. Your story is not too complicated. You don't need to have the answers. You don't need to fix yourself first. You don't need to know where you're going. You only need to know this: you are seen. And not with the kind of glance the world gives, the fleeting kind, the judgmental kind, the kind that measures you against others. Number you are seen with the eyes of love, with understanding, with deep compassion. You are seen the way a parent sees a hurting child, the way an artist sees beauty in the unformed clay, the way God saw Hagar, fully, entirely, tenderly. And once you've been seen by God, even the wilderness becomes holy. Even your tears become sacred. Even your scars begin to shine. Not because the pain disappears, but because you now know, I was never alone. You are not invisible. You are seen. You are heard. You are loved. And like Hagar, you carry within you a testimony that no one can erase, a truth born in the hardest places, that the God of the universe sees even the one who feels forgotten, that he finds us when we run, that he speaks when all other voices fall silent, and that even in the wilderness, he calls us by name.